Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Language Arts Gallery. Today, we're going to continue with Lesson 3 of writing a personal essay, and we're going to talk about the importance of building a claim in our personal essays and how we can do that. So remember to please click subscribe so you get all the videos in this series of lessons, as well as all my creative writing and academic writing videos. So we've been talking about what separates a personal essay from a memoir. We said that when we're writing a memoir, we're simply retelling events, whereas when we're writing a personal essay, we're making a claim. We're talking about a general truth or something that we've learned through our experience. And we talked about the importance of reflecting on the story that we're telling in order to make that truth clear to our audience. So when we're making this claim about this universal truth or this message, we want to ensure that we're doing three things with our claim. And today we're going to talk about what those three things are. So let's get started. In order to have a strong claim in a personal essay, we want to make sure that it is specific, arguable, and meaningful. So by specific, we don't want it to be very vague or very general, something like school is important, which we have listed here at the bottom. We want to be really specific and detailed in terms of what it is we're telling our audience. And here we've got a more specific claim. Even one teacher's encouragement can change a student's life. Second, we want it to be arguable. We don't want it to be too obvious or too factual. In other words, a reasonable person should be able to disagree with this. And finally, we want it to be meaningful, not just to us. We've told the story and we've told how this is true based on our own lived experience, but hopefully this is something that other readers will also care about when they read our essay. So let's go ahead and let's work through each of these step by step. And we're going to start with specific versus non-specific claims. Now, I've got a non-specific claim here. It says family traditions are important. This is very, very general. Here, I've got a more specific claim, and I can see how this would easily be linked to my lived experiences. It says, my grandmother's storytelling taught me that traditions give us strength in uncertain times. So that's based on family traditions, but it's much more specific. Let's take a look at another one. Sports teach us important lessons. And losing a basketball game taught me more about teamwork than winning ever did. So sports teach us important lessons. Yeah, that's true, but that's very general. That could apply to so many different things. Here we're talking specifically about teamwork and losing. Those are two very important details that will link to that author's lived experience. So we want to include details, we want to reference this in our story, and we want to share a clear life lesson for our audience. So remember, if you're not specific, the reader doesn't know what's going to make your story unique. You want to paint a clear and detailed experience or perspective so your reader can see how the story you're telling relates to the claim that you're making. So I've got an example here. It says, when I started high school, I thought being on the soccer team would be just about winning games. But one Saturday, after a tough loss, our coach asked us to share what we learned from the match. That day, I realized the real value of sports wasn't victory. It was the bond we built when we failed together. So now this is, of course, a very brief excerpt, but I want you to look for the claim in this passage and how the author is specific with that claim. So if I go here, I can see that the real value of sports wasn't victory. It was the bond we built when we failed together. So the author in his claim talks about a specific lesson. He talks about building a bond with his team, and there are clear details in the text that relate the lesson and make it unique. The author talks about high school soccer, the coach and the coach's tough questions, and a tough loss that his team endured. So now let's look at what makes claims arguable. So here I've got some things that aren't arguable. They're just obvious or they're considered general truths. Water's necessary to live. Young people use social media. Studying can improve your grades. No reasonable person is really going to disagree with any of these things. So if something's factual or it's obvious, it's not arguable. So the reader's going to look at this and say, of course, so what? So try to think of some other claims that aren't arguable. And we looked at some things like, well, school is important. I guess that might be arguable. We might say something like, family's important, exercise makes us healthy, things like that. Those are all things that most people are generally going to agree with. So now let's look at what we can do to make a claim arguable. Young people use social media. So that's true, but what can we say to make this arguable? Social media connects us, but can make real friendships harder. Now, some people would disagree with that. Some people might say, no, I have no problem making and maintaining real life relationships, and I'm also an avid social media user. Other people might say, I agree with that. I find when I spend more time on social media, I have less time for my real friends. So that's certainly more arguable because it is debatable. And hopefully, when we share our lived experience, we're going to be able to support our side of the argument. So, hopefully, if we've written an arguable claim, we've given the reader something to think about, or as I said, to possibly disagree with. And here I've got an inarguable claim: exercise is healthy, right? How could we craft that into something that someone might disagree with? Well, I might say something like, for me, running isn't about good health. It's about finding mental clarity I can't get anywhere else. So I'm talking about exercise, but I'm not just talking about exercise being healthy. I'm talking about running's not about good health. It's about mental clarity. Someone might say, well, okay, but that's arguable. You get that mental clarity because you're working on your health, or good physical health and good mental health are linked. So it is actually about being healthy. So there are, I don't want to say two sides, but there are many perspectives that you could take with this claim. So it's arguable. So I want you to look at the following claims and think about how you can make them arguable. So if you want, you can pause the video and then work through this. The first is, good grades in school matter, failure is disappointing, and teamwork is important. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video and work through this. Okay, now let's go over some possible answers. Good grades aren't a sign of intelligence. That's certainly arguable. A lot of people think that good grades might simply be a product of perseverance. Failure is disappointing. We might say, failure teaches us more than success ever will. And teamwork is important. We might say, teamwork isn't about splitting the work evenly. It's about trusting others when you can't do it alone. So we might talk about synergy in teamwork here. That would be another way that we could talk about the value of teamwork. So finally, let's talk about meaningful claims. So if you've had an experience that you think is valuable, it taught you a lesson, chances are that someone else out there has either had a similar experience and maybe not been able to reflect on it the way you did, or they're searching for the lesson that you learned through your experience. So without them having to go through a difficult experience, you can share that with them. So these people need to hear your story. Okay, so a meaningful claim should answer the question, so what? As a writer, you need to connect your story in a meaningful way so the audience sees how this message can apply to their own lives. So let's put this together here. Last summer, I worked at an ice cream shop. It was fun most of the time, but there were also tough moments when customers got impatient. At first, I thought it was just a job, but by the end, I realized I had learned something about myself. Okay, this isn't very good, right? It's not a very specific claim. Um, there's not because of the lack of specifics here, there's nothing that's really arguable, and I can't really make this something that I can connect to my own life. So how can we improve this? Okay. So hopefully you've had a chance to work through this and you can make this into something that is specific, arguable, and meaningful. So now let's talk about selecting a story. After you've written your claim, okay, you want to have a story that supports your claim. Because remember, we said that in a memoir, we're simply sharing an experience. We might have elements of reflection, but we're simply sharing our experience. When we're writing an opinion essay, we're trying to prove something, right? We're using facts, details to support whatever it is that we're arguing, whatever our thesis is. Here we've got a claim and we're supporting it with a story. That's what makes a personal essay really unique. Okay, so when we only have a claim, that's a lecture. When we're only telling a story, that's a memoir or a personal narrative. But when we put them together, we've got a personal essay. So this is the intersection of our voice and our message. So let's look at the following claim. Belonging often starts with a small act of courage. That's terrific. I love that. Certainly arguable. I think it's specific. So which story might best support this? Joining the robotics club after weeks of just watching from the hallway? Playing video games alone at home on a Saturday? Or eating lunch with the same group of friends you've had since kindergarten? So this is pretty simple. It's going to be the first one, right? We're talking about courage here. So the story has to have a moment where someone showed courage and took a risk. If you're eating with friends that you've had since kindergarten, you've known these people for a really long time, you probably feel very comfortable with them. So there's not a lot of courage involved here. Playing alone certainly doesn't connect to courage, but joining a club when you're an outsider, that's a moment of risk and growth, and it directly supports your claim. So now let's look at a mentor text together, and we're going to focus on how the story supports a claim. Okay, so I'm going to move over here, and it says, when I started college, I thought the hardest part would be adjusting to academics. I was ready for long nights of studying, big lectures, and papers that felt intimidating. What I wasn't prepared for was what happened instead. Halfway through my first semester, my father lost his job. Overnight, our family finances shifted. The tuition payments that once seemed manageable suddenly felt like a crushing weight. And for the first time, I wondered whether my education might slip out of reach. Okay, so I think the author's done a great job setting up a problem here. We know that we're going to hear about this author facing some type of adversity in getting his or her education. I picked up extra shifts at a local cafe to help cover expenses, even though I had never balanced serious work in school before. That meant late nights of wiping down counters, the smell of coffee clinging to my clothes, and early mornings rushing to class on little sleep. I remember the embarrassment of nodding off in a lecture, the sting of a professor's disappointed glance, and the frustration of barely having time to meet with study groups. More than once, I fought back tears while walking across campus, carrying both my backpack and the invisible weight of financial stress. At times, I wondered if it was worth staying in school at all. The pressure felt endless, and quitting seemed like it would at least bring relief. But gradually, I noticed something changing in me. So here, as the author is presenting this, I know that we're getting towards some type of experience that's going to teach them a lesson that they're going to share with us. I was becoming more efficient with my time, learning to finish homework during short breaks and studying in the quiet corners of the cafe between shifts. I learned how to prioritize, how to squeeze assignments into odd pockets of the day, and how to keep going, even when I was exhausted. My days weren't easy, but I began to see myself surviving them in a way I hadn't thought possible. Looking back, I realized resilience isn't about handling life when it's comfortable. It's about adapting when circumstances leave you no choice and finding ways to move forward when everything feels stacked against you. Losing my father's financial support felt unfair and overwhelming at the time, but it forced me to discover a strength I never would have developed otherwise. More than grades or recognition, that strength has become the most valuable thing I've carried from my first year of college. Okay, so I can see here that the author has really learned something incredible. He discovered a strength he never would have developed otherwise. Okay, so uh, he said that it's about adapting when you have no choice and finding ways to move forward even when everything feels stacked against you. He talked about the challenge of his father losing his job, how the author learned to be more efficient with his or her time. And that all supports this claim of moving forward when everything feels stacked against you, discovering that strength. If the story had been retold just as working late without reflecting, how would it have been weaker? Well, certainly it would have sounded, I think, more like a sob story, more like just, oh, look at this terrible thing that happened to me. But they're reflecting on what they gained from it and they're sharing that with the reader. Okay, so the authors, as I said, not just telling a sad story, they're reflecting, they're sharing a lesson, and that's what makes a personal essay. They're showing resilience, and that connects back to his or her claim. Okay, so I'm going to leave this for you for homework. Okay, this is a very short excerpt about a driving test. I'm going to let you read this. This needs to be improved. You don't necessarily need to rewrite it. You can, but most importantly, what you need to do is you need to think about how and where you would add details to change this. Okay, now if you get this lesson, which is available in my Teachers Pay Teachers store, you've got this graphic organizer, which includes everything we need to connect our claim to our story. And all of this builds upon what we learned in our first creative writing course, which you can also find linked in the video description. All right, so thank you all so much for joining me, and I'll see you in our next video at the Language Arts Gallery.